You're listening to Staying in the Game, a Plum Dragon Herbs podcast where we have conversations about mindset and techniques for staying at the top of your game. I'm your host, Janelle Leatherwood. Joining us today is Olympic weightlifting coach Robert Ronan, who has traveled to mainland China several times to study the technique they use in this sport. Coach Ronan is one of only a handful of Western weightlifting coaches invited to professional training facilities in China. Robert and the team at Austin Barbell work with athletes of all levels and ages, from beginners to national competitors. He was a competition coach for World Master Champion Jianping Ma in the 2019 IWF World Master Championships and is currently working with athletes to qualify for national events. Welcome to our show, Rob.
Thanks for having me, Janelle.
Yes, absolutely. So I was thinking it would be great if you could begin with giving us an overview of what Olympic weightlifting is.
So Olympic weightlifting is probably the most objective and simplified sport there is. It basically comes down to one simple thing, which is lifting a heavy object off the floor, which is a barbell loaded with plates within a designated amount of time and putting it above your head. Mm-hmm. So that sounds very simple. And there are, there's dozens of rules around it, and we'll get into a little bit of that. And that's sort of how the training, is shaped around Olympic weightlifting. But at the end of the day, it's really lifting a bar, putting it above your head within a given amount of time. So again, that sounds very simple. It's very objective, but when you get down to it, the amount of training that goes into Olympic weightlifting is 99% of the time. So with Olympic weightlifting, and not to be mistaken with, powerlifting or CrossFit or anything else, there's two significant lifts that are performed within the sport. And some could argue three. So you've got the Snatch, which is lifting the bar, one single movement, and basically catching and receiving the bar from a squat position or from a low position. And then you've got the clean and jerk. Mm-hmm. And the clean and jerk is you pull the bar, you rack it on your chest or, front rack position, and then you jerk it above head. So really three movements overall. The Snatch generally takes place in less than 1 second. The clean and jerk about 2 seconds because it's two different movements. Each athlete will have 3 attempts at each lift. So 3 attempts at the Snatch, 3 attempts at the clean and jerk. And they've got 1 minute in time to complete that lift. So that sounds very simple. It's very objective, very easy. And what complicates things is, you've got 3 judges in front of you, or 3 referees rather, that are judging you. Mm-hmm. And they're looking for specific things like, making sure that all the technical rules are met, that you lock out in one single movement, that your elbows aren't bent, making sure there's a technical marshal that's making sure that, that everything is met from a technical perspective. Is the bar loaded correctly? Are you wearing the right uniform, or what they call a costume in the sport? Things along those lines. And then there's rules wrapped around, how you can call individual numbers for an athlete going up for a lift. Mm-hmm. So where it gets really fun is that if you've got an athlete that's, competing against somebody very close in size or strength, or if they're competing against themselves. Yeah. So in many cases, what can happen is an athlete may follow themselves within a competition. So that competition, they may hit, let's say, a 100-kilo snatch. And then they have to follow themselves. They get a 2-minute clock for the next lift. So you're basically going for a maximum attempt. In some cases, these are attempts where the athlete is in uncharted water, hitting lifts that they've never hit before. So from a mental perspective, it's very nerve-wracking. You're in this skin-tight outfit in front of a bunch of strangers, being objectively judged, for something that you've trained. Could be 6 months, could be a year. This could be, a world championship of some sort, and it all comes down to 1 second. So right. This is why the training is so important, just not from a physio standpoint, but also from a mental standpoint. You have to be prepared to compete. Yes.
And so if technically all things are equal between the athletes competing,
then what gives them an edge? Is it the style?
There's a couple things. So the sport is broken up into divisions. So you got size, gender, age, and that all determines, the category in which the athlete will be in. So for females, it'll be, and actually this is where I'm going to blank out. I believe there's 10 categories for female, 10 for male. So they could have a female category of, let's say it's a 59 kilo category, and it's all metric because it's an international sport. That 59 kilo category could have athletes in an open category, which are, teenage age, all the way up to, 35-year-old. Once they hit 35, you hit masters, and then every 5 years it increments. And basically, those categories change. As someone gets older, their strength obviously starts to diminish and they have more problems physically. So all things are equal to some extent. What really sets them apart at the end of the day is, how prepared you are for competition. A lot of people, they may train. What we see in this country is we see a lot of athletes that will train in functional fitness or CrossFit or something along those lines. And then they supplement their CrossFit training with Olympic weightlifting. What we do at Austin Barbell is very different. My athletes are full-time Olympic weightlifters in terms of that's their only athletic discipline that they adhere to. Many of them are not CrossFitters. And we find that, when you focus on too many movements, what will ultimately happen is it's very difficult to get proficient in anything. So we really just train for those two movements. And the training itself it's not what you would think in terms of like just doing those two movements over and over. We try to add a lot of variety, a lot of accessory movements, really try to prepare the athlete for any situation they may encounter when they get to competition. And you really have to think of all situations. It could be something as simple as, the bathroom is 200 feet from the platform and, and someone needs to be prepared to encounter that. It could be, where there's a temperature change. Maybe we train in an air conditioned environment, which we're very fortunate to do in Texas because it's 110 degrees here in the summer. But a lot of competitions will be in smaller venues where they may not have a temperature controlled environment. So there'll be days where we train, without AC to get athletes prepared for that aspect of it. Yeah. Different times a day, training in the morning versus training in the afternoon. You never know within a competition if you're going to be competing at, the crack of dawn or if it's going to be 8 p.m.
So just training them for overall this very high pressure, intense competitive setting is really key. It sounds like
it's absolutely key. Yeah. And not to, to take it a step further, most athletes are somewhat starving themselves in order to make weight so that they can be in the category they want to compete in. So a lot of my athletes will typically weigh 2 to 3 kilograms over their designated body weight or for their category. And when they go to weigh in, unlike boxing or other sports, they have to weigh in basically 2 hours before they hit the platform for competition. So many of these athletes are dehydrated. They're hungry. They're a little hangry sometimes. And we try to get them hydrated and back up to where they need to be before they, make that first lift. And then, add anxiety and stress to the situation. It really makes things, intense sometimes.
Yeah. And that's actually a whole other topic is cutting weight and trying to do that safely that I'm sure we could go into. I was recently listening to a podcast about that and how tough that is for athletes to do that.
You have to be realistic. A lot of athletes will, they'll come in and they'll be in an 81 kilo category and they say they want to cut to a 73 because they believe they'll be stronger. And, in this sport, because you're lifting weight, the rules of physics, it takes weight to move weight. So if you cut weight, you will move less. You're not going to be able to maintain that strength. And generally, you'll just, be physically weaker and mentally drained because, you're dehydrated.
Yeah. So let's talk now for a minute about some of the travel you did in China and studying their techniques. And so tell me what is different about the style of training that you teach?
So let's go back to 2015, I believe. Was my first trip to China. I went to a city called Hefei, which it's sort of a industrial city. Lots of pollution, not much going on there, but they do have an Olympic training center. Mm-hmm. I went with a kind of a tour provider or a camp provider called Ma Strength. They were, very good at setting up and making sure that everybody could get access at that given time. So my first impressions in terms of walking into a training center was, wow, everybody is so young. I'm in my mid 40s, and upon walking in, you see children, you see young athletes, and then you've got just the athlete to coach ratio is just overwhelming. But they always start these athletes out in these general preparedness programs or GPP. And generally what they're doing is they're trying to determine where the athletes are going to go in terms of their career within the Chinese sports system. Mm-hmm. So they'll be in flexibility training, their bodies are still developing in terms of, everybody has an ideal body type for certain types of sports. Obviously a sprinter is going to be, long and lean, where a basketball player might be taller. And an Olympic weightlifter, in most cases, the best body type is, somebody who's a bit shorter, short legs, long torso. It really gives the athlete, the perfect advantage in terms of like levers. So upon going there, we walk into this, flexibility training where we see all these young boys and girls like getting into these pretzel yoga positions. It was very stressful to watch them. Yeah. And that was interesting in itself, how serious, China takes this, just takes sports in general. It's a bit of a system. And when you start off with such a large population of athletes, it's very easy, to refine and build that Olympic quality, platform or podium, ready athlete at the end of the day. So, they start off with, 500,000 weightlifters in the beginning. And then at the end, they've got 8 athletes for their world team on the male and 8 on their female side. So when you really look at the numbers, it's astonishing, but this is how they're able to accomplish gold medals, every quad. And what I mean by quad is for every Olympic, games that's held. Uh-huh. So the training itself on the Olympic weightlifting side it's dramatically different than what we're doing here. So because the athletes are starting at such a young age, they're prepared differently. So what we find is that when you take a younger athlete and you expose them to technical drills and flexibility drills, their body is in a position where they can start handling weight when they start going through puberty and change. Wow. Whereas in this country, what we find is a lot of parents will sort of back off on strength sports until that athlete gets past puberty. And what effectively happens then is that you have an athlete that has like little flexibility. They're just not prepared from a balance perspective. They don't understand motor control, and they have a hard time adapting, to these new movements. Not saying that they can't. It just comes later in age, and it could be as big of a gap as 8 years in terms of athletic development. Mm-hmm. And in the sport of Olympic weightlifting, your time in terms of like when you peak, it's very finite. You have 4 to 8 years maximum where you're at the top of your game. Unlike, baseball, where you can be, at the top of the game for, 16 years if you're good.
Yeah.
So starting athletes young is key within the Chinese system. And then they have multiple tiers of how they bring athletes through the schooling. So they'll have feeder schools, which are these smaller developmental schools where they work on what I just spoke about in terms of like flexibility and technique. Mm-hmm. And then they move them into an intermediate school or a provincial school if they're good enough. And then from there, they'll start working, provincial being state level. They'll start training in more of a closed setting with coaches on a smaller ratio. So instead of at the child level, where it's, maybe 15 kids to one coach, it'll be maybe 4 athletes to one coach. Mm-hmm. And that's where the coaches really start diving into, the specifics of the sport itself. looking, really for finding technique. It's very detail oriented and it's very tactical. Really, when you look at the sport from a time perspective, the Russians really had like the greatest amount of accomplishment early on in like the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And they did it. A lot of this was done through observation, science, research, heavy documentation, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't, and then applying that towards athletes as they move forward. The Chinese system is somewhat different. They've taken everything that they've learned from the Russians and they've applied that. And now that it's more tactical, where the Russians would take a program that could be written a year in advance and say, if the athlete follows this program to the T, they'll end up in competition and they'll do well.
Yeah.
Where the Chinese are more, let's change based on the situation on a day-to-day basis, based on what we see, and adjust for, adjust in the short term for a long-term result. And
so what aspects of what training you've seen abroad have you brought back to your facility, would you say?
So we follow a similar mindset in terms of adjusting based on, the situation. Mm-hmm. We always program with a goal in mind in terms of what we're presenting to our athletes. So if we have athletes that are competing twice a year, we'll look at that athlete's deficiencies and we'll try to build a program and a training structure around, where they need to be in a given time. But we're always looking at the situation on a daily basis, trying to figure out, what we can do in order to make that athlete better for that training session, just not the long-term view. So in my experience, it's the small details that really have the biggest impact. Specifically, when you're looking at, something that's very technical, it's very detail orientated. And, the smallest variance in terms of mistake can really, it can basically cost you a 1 kilo difference, which is, just over 2 pounds, could be the difference of, you making the championship, getting a gold or getting a silver. I mean, mm-hmm. it's quite significant. So precision is really the most, important thing when we're dealing with our athletes.
Mm-hmm. And when we talked earlier last week, you mentioned some key things like speed, stability, timing.
Sure. So one of the things that the Chinese system does very well, and I'm not saying other systems aren't doing this, but the Chinese system has made it very simple for any coach to walk into any situation with any athlete. And they built these principles or guidelines. And what those are basically, it's 5 words. It's very simple. Every sport within, the Olympic Training Center has these. So for Olympic weightlifting, it's close, fast, low, stable timing. For instance, in, Olympic diving, one of the words is knife. Mm-hmm. And that, obviously to cut through the water is as best as possible or quickly as possible with the least amount of splash. But Olympic weightlifting, if you can adhere to these 5 principles, and not everybody is going to be, able to, master every 5. But if you can adhere or stick to, the vast majority of them, you will be proficient in the sport. So these are, fundamental properties that make a good athlete. So when you lift the bar, you want it to be close to you, keeping that bar, as close to the center of balance as possible. As that bar deviates and pushes out from an athlete's body, it gets heavier. And then there's more chance of that, lift being failed.
Yeah.
In terms of speed, always important, but we're always focused on the speed underneath the bar, not so much, how fast that athlete can pull the bar. It's important, but it's more important for that athlete to be able to sit down and receive the bar and, not have the bar crash on them and make that lift. Mm-hmm. Getting low, this is a flexibility, aspect of the sport. You have to be flexible as a gymnast. You have to be graceful as a dancer, and you have to be able to, sit down with for every inch you can, drop below the bar, it's a greater chance that you can receive the bar, and less that you have to lift the bar up. So let's think the lifting apparatus is a barbell, and for every inch you have to lift this thing above your head, it gets incrementally harder. So if you can sit lower, it just gets easier.
Yeah, and helps prevent injuries.
Exactly. So we work a lot on flexibility, really trying to get athletes in those, hopefully they're comfortable positions, but at first generally they're uncomfortable. Being stable is important, making sure that when they catch the bar, they're not, the shoulders can lock, they're not necessarily shaking. that they're in a position where the bar is not going to move forward or backwards. You want that barbell and that athlete to be in the same horizontal plane, or vertical plane.
Mm-hmm.
And then the timing is necessary in terms of how they lift the bar. Just like a dance move, if you've got, a couple, dancers on stage and one dancer is not in sync with the others, it's very obvious. Same thing in Olympic weightlifting. If they're lifting the bar and the timing is not precise, they're going to pull under too quickly. They're not going to pull in time. They'll jump forward, jump back. All these, errors can happen.
Yeah. That's great. I really love that rundown of all those different principles. You call them the five
Chinese weightlifting principles. And like I mentioned before, every system has, their own principles for weightlifting. And these principles apply to universally to all systems, American, Russian. However, where the Chinese did very well is that, portability of allowing the coaches to, taking a coach from a high level training center based on, these principles, they can then walk into a junior level, training facility and then start coaching.
Mm-hmm.
All the coaches are universally trained because it's a system. And that's really, the key point here is that, we're trying to take a system that's been developed in another country and apply it towards Western athletes at Austin Barbell.
Yeah.
What we find in a lot of other, what we find here in the U.S., which is great, they've got certification programs and whatnot, is that it's not a very systematic approach. It's more of a, let's teach people fundamentals and push them out into the coaching, populace.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in our belief, taking a system and applying it, making it repeatable is really the approach that works the best with our athletes from what we've seen.
Yeah. So take me through like a day in training in your facilities. I know right now athletes are having to stay home, but what would a typical day in your training center look like?
Sure. So a typical day, we train our athletes. Most of them train 4 days a week. Some train 5. Some of the even younger ones will train 6 days. And we've had a couple of athletes that will train doubles. And what that means is that they're training morning and afternoon. And we split the session up. But a typical day would be, it's a 2-hour training session. There's typically, depending on the day of the week and where we are in the program in terms of competition cycle, we'll be emphasizing on generally one primary lift, either snatch or clean and jerk. There's different variations of those. It could be a power snatch, it could be a full snatch, muscle snatch, or what have you. And then we'll generally move into, after we go through our classic lift or primary lift, there's a certain amount of technique training or speed training that's involved. And speed training is just that. You're trying to teach the athlete to be faster. And that's what takes time. Speed is very hard to teach. Some people are naturally gifted with it and they do very well in the sport. And some people need to develop it.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously, because it's weightlifting, there's a strength component as well. So we generally finish off with strength movements, pulls, which are similar to a deadlift, or squats. And there's different variations of that as well. And the amount of volume that we're, putting towards these athletes generally changes based on where they are within their competition cycle. So there'll be more volume for an athlete when they're not headed towards competition. And
Mm-hmm.
conditioning is a big part of this. You want the athlete to be able to take on, as much work as possible, or work capacity, so that they can actually, train at higher levels so that you can build their strength up and then you taper them off in time for competition.
So they have a very rigorous training regimen. How do they recover?
Athletes recovery is, I've taken a lot of the principles that I've learned in China and I've applied it towards our athletes. And some of which I've found were great and some, not so much. So my first exposure, in a Chinese weightlifting hall, there was a team doctor. And the team doctor, I'm like, oh, this is very interesting. There's a doctor. And, not a doctor in the traditional sense of Western medicine. They were doing a lot of acupuncture, a lot of myofascial release, different types of stretches in order to, keep the athlete mobile. I even had some, that doctor do a little work on my shoulder on my first visit. And, honestly, with amazing results. But the biggest thing that we're doing in our gym, post training, is that myofascial release. So we're doing a lot of tempering. People are walking on each other's backs. We're trying to keep everybody as loose as possible post training, so that they're not tensing up and going home in this tight position. And this is where they start losing flexibility. We want them to be ready for the next session. For some of the older athletes, and this is sort of, against what Chinese principles teach, is I feel ice or ice baths or even cryotherapy is ideal. Mm-hmm. What we found in China is they generally shy away from anything cold. Heat is always, ideal.
Yeah.
And then sauna is also a huge component for any athlete in this sport, specifically more as they get closer to competition. Mm-hmm.
And how often are they having to compete in Olympic weightlifting in a non-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, for sure. So, a lot of our athletes, when we get athletes in and they're brand new to the sport, we generally push them into what we call a mock meet very quickly. And that's to really kind of get the butterflies out of the stomach, get them exposed to the sport. And really what the sport is at the end of the day, it is 99% training, but there is a competitive aspect to it. And it's important that you participate in that, because that's where one is going to learn, that's where they're going to learn, the most about what they've taken on as an athlete up to that point. That's right. Where all the deficiencies come out. That's where everything is exposed. Maybe it's, nerves on the platform. Maybe, they have a hard time pulling. Maybe they have a hard time keeping the bar closed, but that's where all the truths come out. So within the first 2 months of an athlete joining Austin Barbell, new or not, we generally push them out to competition. And that'll be a non-sanctioned meet. It's internal. So you're lifting in front of your teammates, and it's a good time, and people have a lot of fun with it. For my athletes that are more seasoned, we generally target 2 to 3 competitions per year. Okay. And that what generally determines that is, do they have any longer term goals? Like I've got one athlete that's trying to make the world master team. And in order for her to do that, she's got to hit specific events leading up to that. So she'll compete more than 2 times this year. She'll probably compete 4. Mm-hmm. And for some athletes, that's fine. For some other athletes, twice a year is more than accommodating. The younger athletes can definitely do more. The older athletes need to train and prepare a little differently. And, we take that into consideration as well when you're over the age of 35. Yeah.
So what are your athletes doing right now to adapt their training schedules with the statewide COVID-19 lockdowns?
Yeah, so it's been a bit of a challenge. We've kept programming going for our athletes, and nothing's changed there. We did adapt a little bit based on, there was a slight break in training, while we tried to figure out what to do. Mm-hmm. We actually lent out all the equipment from the gym to all of our athletes so that they can continue training at home. And we're doing Zoom sessions, similar to Skype or WebEx. These Zoom sessions are quite good. And to be honest, as a coach, I've now got a screen in front of me, and I've got, I can watch, 8 to 10 athletes train at the same time, versus when you're in a training hall and basically walking up and down that hall, trying to, capture as much as possible and add feedback where necessary. So I'm basically able to see everything at the same time versus only 1 or 2 athletes at the same time. So there is an advantage to, remote training. The disadvantages for me, generally in team training within our training hall, I do 10,000 steps. Yeah. And now I'm only putting in maybe, 1,200 a day, and that's just in my home. So it's been a bit of an adaptive period for athletes. But I'm hopeful this will all be over soon, and, they'll be back to training, together again. Yeah. I think that's the biggest difference for everybody, is that the camaraderie is not the same. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people enjoy that team training environment. And, when you're training solo, it's very taxing, mentally. It's very tough. And I've got to tip my hat to those athletes that, train in the garage by themselves and without a coach. And, it's a very difficult thing to do. You sort of get lost in your thoughts. And for some people that works, and for some, it's difficult to get through.
Yeah, so. No, I know what you mean. My 9-year-old son, he takes a Hapkido martial arts class, and they've been sending me emails that he can now do it on Zoom. And at first he had no interest. He's like, he likes to be in the class and show off his skills in front of other people. But just last week, he's like, well, maybe I'll go ahead and do it, you know. So it takes an adjustment, but there is that camaraderie of being with other people that you can't mimic online, you know.
We feel, in this, I found this to be true in China as well. One of the big aspects of training is when you go up to the bar and you're lifting, 90% or higher, you have your team cheer you on. And that's a hard thing to do when you're over a Zoom session. When you're in the training hall and your teammates are cheering you on and motivating you. And there is a motivational factor for everybody cheering you on before you lift something heavy. Yeah. That really, it really fuels you at the end of the day. And when you're in a garage by yourself, especially, most of these garages aren't temperature controlled, so it's quite hot.
Yeah.
It can be demoralizing at times.
Yeah. And hey, as far as getting all your steps in, you could just put your screens in front of like a treadmill or something.
That's a great idea. I haven't thought of that.
Well, let's see. Now, I wanted to ask you, what are some things that you might say to an athlete as they're in the staging area, getting ready to go out on stage, knowing they just have a second to showcase their best,
Sure. So it sort of all depends on the situation. So if that athlete went out and they've already made their first lift, great. That's a moment where, there's a sigh of relief. We don't have to put there's less pressure on the athlete because it's a bit of a strategy when they go out there. It's sort of like a chess game. Generally there's one or two athletes that are very close in terms of competitive numbers to the athlete that you're putting out there. And it's your job as the coach to, build a strategy, try to figure out a way to, either push the other athletes out quicker or sooner when they're unprepared. Because remember, you only have, a minute to 2 minutes to prepare for a lift. And if you're, you got to time it right. And if that athlete's not timed correctly, they're going to go out and miss that lift, either because they're not mentally prepared or they're just not physically prepared. So things that I'm telling my athlete, and I use this quite a bit. I tell them they're monsters. I don't know why. I started doing this, a number of years ago, and I tell them they're monsters. I'm generally, either massaging their calves or slapping them on the back. My coach, who was Russian or Belarusian, he would sort of slap you in the earlobes, and you get this ringing effect in your eardrums. There's this whole ritual of things that coaches do, and they're all, at the end of the day, it's a motivational distraction. So you want to distract the athlete from everything that's around them and just go out and perform. One of the things that I don't like is when athletes are listening to, they got their big headphones on and they're, in the music, and then they want to go out there. What I find is as soon as they take those ear pods off or, big ear headphones, they tend to, it's like a moment of shock, right? Because you go from this music environment to like silence. So we generally try to motivate the athletes, get them pumped up to go. I give them a couple cues on things that they can, do if I see any sort of deficiencies in the back room while they're warming up. Maybe they're not keeping the bar as close as they should. Maybe they need to be more explosive, as they connect at the hip. And I'll give them only one or two things. I'm not going to walk them through a litany of, instruction as they only have 1 second to perform, a lift. Keep it simple. That's sort of like how we operate here.
Yeah. And then overall, like, how would you say that you're encouraging your athletes to stay in the game, which is our podcast theme?
So the most important thing with Olympic weightlifting, it is a very difficult sport. And I can't say firsthand if it's the most difficult sport out there, but in my opinion, it is. So, all the coaches that I've worked with, all my mentors, it's a sport where as soon as you hit a milestone or you get to that next plateau, it gets incrementally harder. It never gets easier because the weight always goes up. It's always relative to the athlete. So the most important thing is basically show up for training. Never make that excuse. So as long as you're showing up for training, you've gotten half of this. What's the best way to put it? Half of the task is already done. So as long as you're showing up for training and you're moving the bar, at least you're getting reps in. Hopefully they're quality reps. But the most important thing is you need to be present. You can't miss training. It is a program, and just like anything, you're being programmed to do something. So you have an instruction set, you put it into, you perform this, and you hope to get a certain output. So as long as they're showing up to training, that's the first thing. So in order to stay in the game, there's a lot of athletes. I've got a lot of athletes that are younger. I've got a lot of athletes that are older who have adult problems. I tend to find that, I'm also, I wouldn't call myself a life coach, but I'm definitely, trying to work people through their problems to keep them on the platform. Mm-hmm. And I find that, really just, being human about it and not trying to be that, that tough football coach that doesn't give it, doesn't really care about their athletes as long as they perform, doesn't work in this sport. You have to be compassionate. You have to be understanding. You have to be flexible.
Right.
And, I find that's sort of one of the things that, myself and the coaches that work for me, excel at is, we're very accommodating for our athletes. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is not a Chinese sports school. This is not a Soviet sports school. This is not Bulgaria. We do have goals for our athletes. We want them to perform, and the goals that we have for our athletes, those are our athletes' goals. We're just pushing them towards where they want to be. We want to be there with them. But at the end of the day, these are the goals they set for themselves. So we're trying to hold them to it, make them accountable at the end of the day. Yeah. So, if this was a Soviet sports school, if you don't make your numbers, you're out. I mean, it's a different training mindset. And, this is a Western voluntary sport. All of our Olympic athletes in this country basically do it because they love the sport and they want to be a part of it. Where in other countries, it's sort of, they're chosen at birth, so to speak, based on, their genetics or whatnot, and they have no choice. Right. So, we try to be as empathetic as possible and really just try to hold our athletes accountable to their goals.
Yeah. So what are some qualities you look for in an athlete? Like if somebody's trying to decide if this is their sport, what can they look for in themselves even?
So, one of the things that whenever I hold a seminar or a clinic or I get new athletes in for what we call foundations training, which is a one-on-one course between, an athlete and a coach, is that we always ask the athlete, can you dance? Are you a good dancer? Because rhythm is a big part of this. So if you're very stiff and rigid, it's going to be very hard to move a barbell. Performing a snatch is a very graceful thing. It's elegant. It's beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I would say if you have a hard time, relaxing and sort of just like going with the flow, it's going to be very difficult. Obviously, body type does play into, some element to this, but, at the end of the day, we're willing to work with all athletes that are motivated. And, that doesn't really, if they're out of shape in a certain way or they have poor flexibility, I'll definitely call them out on it and say, we need to work on these things before we start putting a barbell above your head. But mentally, I think, I'm looking for folks that are motivated. I don't care about the age. I'm looking for athletes that, will listen to instruction. I like athletes that ask questions. An athlete that asks questions is definitely, going to understand why they're doing something, just not go out and do it because they were told to do it. Yeah. In my mind, I'd like to develop coaches. And, if you can develop a coach or teach somebody to coach, they're going to become a better athlete.
So in their training, are they helping the younger athletes? Because you said you have all different ages. Are they working together at the same time?
So the way training is organized is I generally put a stronger athlete with a weaker athlete or a more experienced athlete with a less experienced athlete. And we generally see, these pairings, they've sort of become like brothers in arms or sisters in arms, depending on, who's training. But there's a lot of accountability on the platform itself. So, and this is also true to the way it works in China. And what effectively happens is you have a senior athlete on a platform working with a junior member, and that always helps out because there's always questions where the coach just can't answer. It could be about how to load the bar correctly. It could be about the movement because, at the end of the day, there's thousands of different ways to explain the same thing. And, sometimes it takes an interpreter in order to, make it correct. Right. But yeah, we definitely see, the more experienced or the older athletes helping the younger ones. we run with a very low coach to athlete ratio. Our training hall has 8 platforms in our South training hall. And of that, we can put about 2, sometimes 3 athletes per platform. And I try to have no more than, 5 to 6 athletes per coach. So this is a pretty good ratio where everybody's getting attention. And, this seems to be the magic number for us. Yeah. When you have 15 athletes to one coach, it's chaotic. It's too difficult. So there's just not enough attention to detail.
Yeah, no, well, I agree that philosophy of having the older ones teach the younger ones not only helps the younger ones, but it helps themselves to solidify in their minds what they're trying to learn as well, And
there's always situations where a more senior athlete will come to me and they'll say, hey, I think this might work better. And I'm always open to hear that sort of feedback. My training was somewhat different than, how everybody is training in this hall. I didn't train in a big training hall. I did for a period of time, but it was more, of a private setting, where, I always aspired or wanted to train with, a bunch of athletes. So, I've had an opportunity to bring in some phenomenal coaches. And, I'm sort of envious. I wish I would have had a chance to train with all these coaches. Because think about, the amount of the amount of development that could have taken place with, all these differing opinions. Right. I've got a coach one of my coaches is from Honduras, and he was on the national team. Amazing guy, but his perspective on coaching is completely different than that of the Chinese or that of the Russians. One of my coaches, I brought him in and he coaches for me now. And he's a Belarusian Olympian, and amazing coach, great philosophy, but again, very different. So when you take all these different, styles, you can really pull out the best pieces and apply it towards the athlete. And that's where I think, we do things a little bit different versus just only one style. We're taking many and making it work.
Yeah, I love that. Well, hey, this has been a really great discussion. I'm excited to share this podcast with other people. And give me some ways that people can get in touch with you if they have more questions.
Sure. So you can reach me at coach@austinbarbell.com. You can also go to austinbarbell.com. We do clinics, we do online programming, and we also have a Chinese weightlifting equipment store. So if you're looking for those hard to find items from China, we stock those.
Okay, great. Well, and I'll put links on our show notes page to that, and we can direct people to find you. And we just appreciate your time, and we're excited to share this with other people and help them see the benefits of the Olympic weightlifting program. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, Janelle. Really enjoyed it.
And thanks to all our listeners for joining us today. To learn more from Robert Ronan, visit us at plumdragonherbs.com. We will post show notes, a transcript, and links to connect with him. And if you liked what you heard today, be sure to click the subscribe button, leave us a comment, and rate us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you like to listen. By doing this, more people will have a chance to hear what our amazing guests have to share. Until next time.